Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bold's Pipeline Fighters Hub seminar. We are excited to have a jam-packed agenda tonight. If you have questions, which I'll repeat this a couple times, you can put them in the chat, or you can also put them, which is preferable, into the Q&A section. That way, when we open it up for questions and answers after each speaker presents, you'll be able to ask questions to that group of speakers. Tonight, we have landowners from the now rejected Atlantic Coast pipeline route that are going to present a new landowner's guide that they along with the Property Rights and Pipeline Center created. It will help landowners we know fighting the carbon pipelines currently in Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Illinois. Then we will hear from Bill with the Pipeline Safety Trust, along with Paul with Bold, where they're going to talk about a brand new report that was issued that really shows the gaps of regulation around carbon pipelines. And then we'll end the evening with an update from Brian Jorde, who will talk about the Easement Action Team LLC, which stands for Landowners and Lawyers Cooperative. And he'll talk about the efforts that are happening throughout all of the states to make sure that power is put back into the hands of landowners. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca. She is with the Property Rights and Pipeline Center. She has been an advocate, making sure that eminent domain is at a centerpiece for all of the pipeline fights that have been championed all across this country. So I'll throw it to her first.
Thank you, Jane. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I run the Property Rights and Pipeline Center, and we're a nonprofit group that works to stop what we see as the misuse of eminent domain for pipelines. We're here to support landowners threatened with eminent domain for a pipeline project. And we offer a bi-monthly national newsletter. No pipeline yard signs can be mailed to you for free. And we have a national landowner conference that we hope to be able to have again soon. That's free to travel to and attend. We also have a YouTube channel with videos telling the stories of eminent domain affected landowners all across the country. I hope you'll check that out. And now with our newly redesigned website, which is still in beta testing, so please, forgive us. We also have a list of vetted eminent domain lawyers. We worked with a think tank in Washington, D.C., the Niskanen Center, and vetted a list of lawyers who understand the issues from landowners' perspectives. So you can see the list of eminent domain lawyers at pipelinecenter.org, and please go and see what the site offers. So the crowning jewel of our new site is the Landowners Rapid Response Guide. This is a step-by-step guide to fighting a pipeline, and it also offers videos breaking down each important step. The guide walks landowners through what specific steps you can take, learn your rights, rally your neighbors, make noise, and find a legal advocate. This wonderful guide is the brainchild of Jill Averitt, a landowner on the now canceled Atlantic Coast Pipeline in Virginia. When that pipeline was canceled in July of 2020, Jill realized that she and her neighbors had spent the last 6 years becoming experts in pipeline resistance. So Jill decided to write down what she learned and reach out to other affected landowners across the country to add input. She and this amazing team created a guide for any landowner facing really any project detrimental to their community. And PRPC couldn't be more proud to house this wonderful guide and videos on our pipelinecenter.org website. So please join me in watching this short teaser about the guide, and then join me in welcoming Jill Averitt to tell you more. Mark, please run the teaser. Thanks. For some reason, the audio is not playing, Mark. We do not know why the audio is not playing.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll-
well, basically, I will then narrate it, which is basically that you're hearing from landowners all around the country. Oh, we think we're starting again with audio. Huh?
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties here. Let me see if I can get that fixed.
Oh, great. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm Jill Averitt, and that's such an exciting trailer to watch. And now that we know that we're live, I could not be happier. We've been working on this for over a year, as Rebecca has said. I'm so excited to be here talking to you today about the Landowners Rapid Response Guide, and I wanted to thank Bold for having us here to announce the launch of this project, and also to acknowledge all of the hard work that both Bold and PRPC are doing for landowners all across the United States. 8 years ago, we received a pre-condemnation survey letter from Dominion Energy saying that they wanted our land for a 32-inch fracked gas pipeline. We were filled with both fear and outrage, and we had a lot of questions. Questions like, what is this? How can a private company take our land? What are our rights? As a property owner, can't I say no? My land is not for sale at any price. This scenario has played out with thousands of landowners all around the country. And when this happened to us, we had nowhere to go for answers other than to talk to our friends in our community. There was literally no information about the process ahead of us and what our rights were. Every time we met with lawyers or organizations fighting pipelines, we found that there was no precedent for stopping the taking of our land for these projects. Well, that's finally changing. We are winning. Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Keystone XL, Jordan Cove, Constitution, and Penn East are just some of the pipelines that have been stopped because of activists like you and me. We are standing on each other's shoulders, and each fight brings us closer to the top. ACP fighters stood on the shoulders of our brothers and sisters at Standing Rock and Keystone XL. We used to say that one of us would get to the top of the wall and start hauling others over. Well, we're there. We're finally at the top, and we're reaching out our hands to pull you up. We learned so much from our 6-year fight against the ACP, and I heard this sentiment over and over again from resistors from all over the country who won their battles. We created the Landowners Rapid Response Guide in an effort to pay it forward to new communities who find themselves where we once were. I could not imagine walking away after we defeated the ACP. We spent so much time over so many years trying to figure it all out, and that we wanted to share this. We wanted to share what we learned. So I compiled some of what we learned with the help from landowners, lawyers, and communities around the United States. And I put it in one place so that it's a simple resource for communities to find support and hope, a place where they can jump right in with a fighting chance to learn more as they go. The guide has now become the backbone of PRPC's website. Here you'll find 4 sections under the tab Landowners Rapid Response Guide at the top. Know your rights, organize as a community, create awareness, and get a lawyer. Each section starts with a video to introduce you to the topic, and the video features landowners and community members just like you, but who have been through this process. They share ideas, information with you to help prepare you for what lies ahead. Below each video, there's easy to read written material about the topic with suggestions moving forward as you figure out where you fit into this space. Each individual has a place and a purpose. Whether you're wanting clarity on what is ahead or whether you and your neighbors want to resist the taking of your land, you'll find support and inspiration in this guide. I want to just take a moment to discuss a little bit about each of the topics. The first one, know your rights. In this section, you'll find clarity on the beginning of what this process looks like. It's a little different for each project. There are interstate pipelines, there are intrastate pipelines, which have different paths. So educating yourself about your project is an important first step. You'll find information about pre-condemnation survey letters, how to file with FERC to become an intervener, and if you have an interstate pipeline, what to do about easement offers, and ways to educate yourself about the project. The pipeline company is likely to tell you as little as possible about what's going to happen, other than it's a done deal, but don't believe them. Oftentimes, they're moving ahead with a project and threatening eminent domain even before the project has all of its permits. They do. Take your time and educate yourself. The next section is organize as a community. Here you'll find great information about getting yourself organized and where you fit in. There's room for everyone in this fight, and you want to include everybody. In the ACP fight, we always use the term death by 1,000 cuts. You never know what action will be the one that brings the project to an end. Allowing people to gather around what they're passionate about will create strong areas of resistance. Support each other, and you will find that together you're stronger. Most importantly, we found we're all fighting for the same thing. I learned so much more than I ever imagined by supporting efforts that initially I didn't agree with, but in the end, it opened my heart and mind to so much more. I formed so many new friends who I would never have met had it weren't for this fight. And in the end, those friendships that you make with unlikely allies will be with you forever, no matter what the outcome. The next topic, create awareness. Here you'll find options for organizing your group once you've gathered around a common interest. We talk about the different ways you can organize to accept donations easily, what steps to take to reach other members of your community, how best to get information out to your community using your unique talents, connecting with allies, and ideas for growing support locally and beyond. Finally, and get a lawyer. This is an important one. No one really likes lawyers. Most of us haven't had to use one and only know that they're really expensive. In this section, we will discuss our own fears when we started this process, the ways in which landowners who did not have a lawyer were taken advantage of, and why you have time to interview lawyers and get the help that you deserve, whether or not you choose to take your case to court or sign an easement offer. Land agents are bullies, and they come on hard. Even before you have any information about the project, they're knocking on your door and asking you to sign an easement. They work for the pipeline company, and their goal is to get you to sign as quickly as possible. So it's important to note that the contracts are written by the pipeline companies, so it's in their favor, not yours. They write these contracts to get everything they want for as little as possible. You need to specifically hire an eminent domain lawyer to get terms that are favorable to you. This is truly a working document. Things are always evolving. So please continue to check back on the site for new information. And if there's ever anything you think would be helpful, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with your comments or ideas so we can keep this resource helpful to the thousands of people ahead of us. Until we can change the laws that make these pipelines possible, affected communities need all the help we can give them. So please visit the PRPC website. There's so much information there to be found. And that's all I've got. We can, if anybody has any questions, happy to answer. I've got Irene Leach and Joyce Burton, who were both part of the filming of the videos, here with us to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jill. And thank you, Rebecca, for the amazing video that I know a lot of landowners had a part in. We are now taking questions for Jill, Joyce, and Irene, as well as Rebecca is available to answer questions. If you're on your phone, Mark sent me a number that you can text a question to as well. So that's 402-302-2611. Again, that's 402-302-2611. And you can also put questions in the Q&A section as well as in the chat. Either myself or Mark will be able to grab that. I'll ask the first questions while folks might be typing some questions in. One of the things that I think people are dealing with right now that might have a pipeline threatening them is they're wondering, you know, what is the advice that you can give when you have a land agent come onto your property? What are some of the things you can do to make sure that they're not bullying you? And things like, you know, do you tell them that they can't come on? Do you record them? What are some of the things that you guys did when that was happening to you?
Irene, you want to talk about this? You've got two that you were fighting.
The first thing that you need to know is what your state law is. And in Virginia, we had a more difficult situation than many states because we have law that says that they can come on our land even if we tell them no. But many people did tell them no, and they, you know, tried all kinds of tricks to get on the property. In my own case, you know, they just came out of nowhere and talked to my mother, who was home by herself, and got her to agree to some of it before we even knew about it. So they're going to push. You can say to them you want information in writing. You can also say to them, you need to know more about the project. You need more information about lots of things, I'm sure. One of the first steps that FERC requires is that they have an open house that provides some information. But again, that's something that the company puts on and controls. I would definitely look at the website. I would definitely contact FERC. They now have citizen contact folks and trying to figure out how to make those work. But I think if people ask them questions and engage with them, that's a good thing to do as well. And then start looking for an attorney.
Yeah, one thing also, you know, in fighting the ACP, I had a lot of contact. I'm not a directly impacted landowner myself, but I had a lot of contact with landowners who told me some really terrible stories of the ways that the land agents and stuff misrepresented things, or would say things to them that later on they promised them things that they said would end up in their easement documents and did not. So I think that, you know, insisting on getting things in writing is important. I think it's important to know who you're talking to. A lot of times the land agents will tell you that they're from the pipeline company and they're actually a contractor, you know, a subcontractor who has no authority a lot of the time. You know, I wouldn't be hesitant to ask for IDs, to take photographs of people's IDs, to record conversations. I mean, that may seem adversarial. These land agents are going to try and pretend that they're your friend, but they work for the pipeline company. They don't work for you. And so I think it's really important to have a good paper trail of what it is that they have promised you or not. And then when you do start getting documents or things from them, to make sure that that's actually what it says. I have a lot of landowners who were promised by the land agent that things were going to be moved, you know, around a particular thing on their property. And then when the plans came out, that wasn't the case. you know, I also think what Irene was saying about, you know, contacting the Office of Public Participation at FERC. This is a new office that they're creating. And I think that if you're having difficulties, that letting FERC know this, you know, whether FERC will respond or not, we don't know yet, but we got to train them, right? You know, they're now saying they're going to try and help when there are problems. Let's hold them to that.
Thank you. We have some other questions that Rebecca is answering in the chat, but I want to bring a couple of them also to the panelists in case folks are also on their phones. One question was about connecting landowners with each other and asking if PRPC or other, you know, pipeline fighting organizations help landowners connect with each other. And is there a way that organizations can help landowners get lists like with the GIS data? So if one of you want to take that one.
Yeah, I don't know if there's organizations that do that now. We sort of did that for ourselves. I mean, in the very beginning with the ACP, we had people who were literally going door to door to find out whether or not people were affected. And then, you know, I think that we were very, very lucky because the Allegheny Blue Ridge Alliance and the put together a whole GIS program that is a tremendous, tremendous resource to us. I don't know how to make that happen in other groups, but it started out from very local efforts, and then people in one county who knew one or two people in another county who were active in things started talking to each other, and we ended up creating all of these alliances of these very, very small local groups. And, you know, the reality is that throughout this whole thing, just keep reminding yourselves that together we are stronger. We are stronger if we are together. The pipeline companies are really good at making people feel isolated. And so, you know, reaching out to other communities and trying to pool your resources together, see if there are some GIS trained people who can help put together mapping things. A lot of this information is out there on the web, and people who know how to use like the Esri systems and things can pull maps from different places and put it together, can get the, what did they call, there's specific coordinates, you know, for where the pipeline is going that eventually, you know, get put into this stuff. I don't know the technicals of it, you know. In the very beginning, sometimes just going to real estate agents in your area to ask them to teach you how to use the county's GIS system so that you can start to learn how to identify other landowners on the route. It's a painstaking process. And someday I hope that we'll have a group that will do this for other communities. I know that the Allegheny Blue Ridge Alliance has created a conservation hub to use some of the tools that they've put together, not specifically for pipeline projects, but for other types of projects in the Allegheny area, in the Allegheny Mountains area. But, you know, they might be someone to reach out to see if they have any ideas of how to develop your own or how to piggyback off of theirs.
And just so folks also know, the Bold Alliance and the Easement Action Team were purchasing the GIS data for local groups in the carbon pipeline fight. So we've done that, except one or two of the states on Summit, but Navigators, we have them for all of the states now. So there's groups like, you know, Rebecca and the Pipeline Resource Center, and then the Bold Alliance and the Pipeline Fighters Hub, and then the Easement Action Team. A lot of groups traditionally focused on the environmental and social justice aspects of the pipeline fighter. So that's why, of the pipeline fights, that's why the new groups that are coming up, like Rebecca and Jill helped start in the Bold Alliance Pipeline Fighters Hub, takes a specific focus to make sure landowners are also part of the key solution. One of the questions was more of a political question, but I think it's good since it's definitely a problem that we're all seeing, I think, in the political realm, is with the high gas prices and the war in Ukraine. It's worrisome that Republicans are very vocal and visible in their push for oil extraction in the US. Do folks think that the Biden administration will cave under so much political pressure in order to build more pipelines?
Rebecca, you want to take that one?
I guess I could take that. I mean, yeah, that is very difficult, but actually, there's a lot of misinformation, so it's very hard. But for example, a lot of these export projects, they're not going to Europe. The pipeline companies are saying that they're sending to non-free trade countries, or they've just inked a big deal with China. So, you know, we can't believe the misinformation that like, oh, if only we could build more pipelines and export more stuff to Europe, it would all be better. That's not true at all. And really what we should be thinking is, this should show us how badly we need to pivot to cleaner energies, because we have this, you know, dictator who is in power because he has all of the resources. And, you know, if Europe didn't need the Russian gas so badly, that would be a whole different thing. So, you know, I don't know about the Biden administration per se. I mean, I hope they don't. We just had the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission walk back some of the good things that they did about their gas pipeline policy, because they got so much pushback from industry and people like Senator Manchin. But, you know, I think we have to tell the other side of the story, which is, you know, the oil and gas industry, they're not your friend, and they're not the ones that, you know, they're buddying up with Russia. And so, you know, don't believe the hype, and let's keep, those of us who care about this, keep the pressure on the Biden administration not to cave. That's all I can say.
And it seems like, you know, we've got sunshine in this country. We've got wind in this country, you know, that it seems like you can take that same thing and turn it around and say, this is even more reasons why we should be shifting away from fossil fuel infrastructure, that we should be sticking to things that we have, which are renewable.
We have time for one more question, and it comes from Charles and Nancy Peak. They say that one of the most important events they experienced in fighting the Keystone XL pipeline was meeting in central Nebraska. People were the East were delayed in getting there, but it meant that they got to share time sharing their stories and connecting with people on a personal level, so they could then trust them in all the other battles that were to come. Were there events that you all did along the Atlantic Coast pipeline that you could maybe give as examples in order to bring landowners together to create that trust and share experiences?
Oh my gosh.
Or-
Lots. Just off the top, a few of them were, we held camps, weekend camps, day camps. I know Bill and Lynn Limpert along the route had a camp that lasted a month or two. Every weekend, different people were coming in just to see where this pipeline was going to go through. Hikes, nature hikes, to point out the destruction of the nature that was going to be destroyed. These old growth forests, streams,
Protests. Protests were fabulous opportunities for people to sort of get rowdy with each other and you know, meet their neighbors.
Yeah.
And the circle of protection.
Yeah.
Artivism, which is a group that has done lots of art related music and all kinds of forms of art. But there was a period of time when regularly they met in Union Hill in near where the compressor station was going to be. And a big part of that was to bring the affected people together to realize they weren't just by themselves. And over time, we all got to know each other. And so then when you had the hearings and the other things, the good part was seeing your friends, you know, but it is important to create that network, whether you create official organizations that you register with the state, and so, or if they're just informal groups, that's really important.
Yeah, we also had information tables at farmers markets and things like that. And you had people there every single week. And so I think one of the things that helps to build trust between people, and again, this isn't just landowners, because the community is our allies in this, even if they're not directly impacted on their property. But when you see the same faces there every week, you start to get to know each other, and it sort of builds a strengthened web within the community, which is going to be important regardless of what the ultimate outcome of the pipeline fight is, or whether it gets finished in a year or gets finished in, God, those poor people in Jordan Cove, how many years were they fighting, right? One of the other things that's really helpful in building that is drawing people in to participate, whether it's having a letter there every week at the farmers market for people to sign. That helps get people sort of bought in and feeling invested in it. So again, having that continuity of presence becomes really, really important.
And doing that all over food and discussions and prayer, circles of protection, prayers, whatever it is, hikes. Yep. You can tap into so many different people by just keep continuing to offer a new idea and bring people together.
Yep. Such good ideas. And one of the lawyers from the Jordan Cove project is actually on, Tonya. So say hello to her. She has the battle scars over the decade of fighting that particular pipeline. So thank you, Jill, Rebecca, Joyce, and Irene, for not only your words today, but for the concrete landowner's guide. People can get that for free at the pipelineCenter.org. The video's on there as well that you can share on social media. Please share that resource far and wide. I know once information is going to happen for the gathering that happens every year, that will be up on the Pipeline Center as well. So you as a landowner can go meet other landowners and share your stories and get new skills. Thank you. Next up, we have Bill from the Pipeline Safety Trust, as well as Paul from the Bold Alliance. Bill and Paul worked on a report with a pipeline expert and issued that last week. That really shows the gaps of regulations when it comes to carbon pipelines. So a lot of us have experience fighting tar sands, oil, or fracked gas pipelines. And then really until about 6 months ago, now we're having to learn a whole new round of fighting pipelines, and they're in the world of carbon pipelines. So Bill's going to talk about that report, the findings of it, and Paul's going to join him, and then we'll open that up for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And thanks so much for having me. My name is Bill Caram. I'm the Executive Director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. I had a PowerPoint prepared, but because it's the expectation usually for these things, but I actually hate PowerPoint. So I'm thrilled that it's not expected and I'm not going to use it. I am here to talk about the CO2 pipeline report, but first I just want to give a brief introduction of our organization for those of you who don't know. The Pipeline Safety Trust was formed in the aftermath of a pipeline tragedy in Bellingham, Washington. In 1999, a pipeline carrying gasoline ruptured, and that gasoline spilled, about 250,000 gallons of that gasoline spilled into a creek. And it eventually ignited and it killed 3 boys in our town. And out of the grief of our town and the families of those boys, they successfully advocated for the formation of a watchdog organization on the pipeline industry and the regulators. And we received an endowment out of the criminal sentencing of the pipeline operator. The judge that day in the sentencing said that we'd have nowhere near the lobbying potential of the oil industry. It's not even David and Goliath, it's more like Bambi and Godzilla. And I certainly feel that most days. But I have to say the risks posed by these CO2 pipelines are exactly why we exist. And so we have been digging into that. Before 2021, before last year, really CO2 pipelines were not on our radar. We were focused fully on hydrocarbon pipelines. And then we had the 1-2 punch. We had Dan's amazing article on the Satarsha incident and disaster in Mississippi on HuffPost. And then right after that, the 45Q tax credit expansion and the infrastructure bill. So right after we learn about what these pipelines can do to a community, we then learn that we have this potential for a huge build out all of a sudden. And that was a pretty tough 1-2 punch. And it quickly became a top priority for our organization to wrap our arms around what this means. So one of the first things we did is we reached out to an independent pipeline engineer who was the eventual author of the report Jane mentioned, Rick Cooperwitz. And we just said, hey, are we overreacting? These seem like they could be really bad. What do you think? And after talking to him, we found, no, we are not overreacting. There are some real fears here. There's, CO2 has very different physical properties from hydrocarbons that lead to unique safety hazards, that the potential impact areas of these pipelines could be measured in miles and not feet like hydrocarbons, and that the regulations on CO2 pipelines are neither appropriate nor sufficient. And I mean, days within having that conversation with Rick, I heard from Paul at Bold with similar concerns. And so we decided to commission Rick for a full report so we could really learn what are the risks and what are the regulatory shortfalls. The first thing really is on the, we looked at the history and we found, many of you may be familiar with a natural CO2 release in Cameroon in 1986 that killed over almost 1,700 people, everybody within a 16-mile radius of the lake, something like that. And after that, the Congress told the regulators, you need to start regulating CO2 pipelines. And so they issued a final rule. And but really all they did is they just kind of said NCO2 in certain places in the regulations. And again, neither appropriate nor sufficient. So out of that report, I'll go over briefly some of the major findings. The first being that in the regulations, there is a very narrow definition of carbon dioxide pipelines. And that is carbon dioxide means a fluid consisting of more than 90% carbon dioxide molecules compressed to a supercritical state. And what that means is that if it is below 90% carbon dioxide, it's not regulated at all. And so if the impurities are more than 10%, and it also means that if it is transported in any other state or phase than this supercritical fluid state, it's not regulated at all. And so a supercritical fluid has some properties of a gas and some properties of a liquid, but it is its own unique, distinct state. And so if it's transported any other way, would not be regulated. So that's a huge shortfall that needs to be fixed. Another big thing we found is that there really is an insufficient process to determine a potential impact area of an incident out of a CO2 pipeline. As I mentioned before, that these impact areas could be measured in miles instead of feet, like a traditional hydrocarbon pipeline. And a hydrocarbon pipeline, calculating that potential impact area is a pretty straightforward calculation based on the diameter of the pipe and the pressure of the pipe. And you can put those numbers in and say, oh, about 250 feet is the death zone or injury zone within that pipeline. It's much more complicated with CO2. You really need some sophisticated modeling because it depends so much on the terrain and the weather at the time as to what that potential impact area is. And this is important because when a population area is determined to be within that potential impact area, those operators have higher safety standards that they have to follow for that pipeline. And we definitely want these pipelines to be held to those higher safety standards if they have the potential to impact people. And I'll point out that all those folks that were sickened in Satartia were outside of what was determined to be the potential impact area of that pipeline. So it's clearly insufficient. Some other things, there's a unique fracture propagation potential in these pipelines. And what that means is there's the potential for a very specific kind of fracture that called a running ductile fracture, which could start the way a traditional rupture or fracture would start. But because of the phase changes of the CO2, if you imagine a zipper, it would almost be like a zipper unzipping a very long section of pipeline very quickly. And so not only would you be releasing a lot of CO2 all at once, again, heavier than air, asphyxiant, but it's a very violent rupture. It throws sections of pipe, shrapnel, leaves large craters behind. And this is something that operators can mitigate against in the way they construct a pipeline. But again, it's not in the regulations anywhere, and it needs to be. We would love to see a requirement for an odorant added to CO2. It's odorless, and after it warms and those dry ice crystals thaw, it's invisible. And so we need something there to let folks know, hey, there's oxygen being displaced. You need to get out of there. We found that there were no standards on contaminants. Things like H2S, hydrogen sulfide, can be found. It's very toxic, very corrosive, and there's no standards in the regulations as to what those limits should be. Something as simple as water can lead to carbonic acid, which has just eats at steel, incredibly corrosive, and also notoriously difficult to remove from CO2 pipelines. So we need to have some standards in the regulations on that. And there's other findings too. I encourage you to go onto our website, pstrust.org, where you can find the report, and you can also find a summary backgrounder that we put together that will go over some of these findings. I want to say that we believe each one of the findings that came out of that report need to be addressed before any pipeline is approved or put in the ground. There is something in these regulations called a grandfather clause, where any new regulation that they pass on design or construction standards only applies to new and replaced pipe. And so any pipe that's already in the ground, they would not apply to. And these shortfalls are just too big to put anybody at risk that way. And so they need to be dealt with before any of these pipelines are considered to go in the ground. That is my summary of the report and the findings, and I will turn it over to Paul.
Hi, again, I'm Paul Blackburn with the Bold Alliance, and I just wanted to point out that what's been proposed here by the industry is a massive expansion of pipeline miles. They're talking about potentially building as many CO2 pipelines as our natural gas pipelines or oil pipelines. And with that kind of expansion, we really do need increased safety. In addition, it's true there are existing CO2 pipelines, but they're relatively few miles. They tend to go from one location, like a geologic CO2 source, to a particular enhanced oil recovery project. And they're sort of straight line projects. They're not very complicated, and most of them aren't very large. Now we're talking about potentially, much, much larger pipelines, interconnected with many different sources that all have the potential to do different kinds of contaminants. And, and if you look at some of the maps that are proposed, they show logical sequencing of like trunk lines with branches going out to different sources and whatnot. But, for the entire country, so this is not just a Midwestern issue. But what we're finding is happening is that they're essentially building private sewer systems, CO2 sewer systems, to hook up to separate customers. So, rather than having a planned structure like you do for roadways, they're just letting the industry build pipelines wherever they want. And even in Iowa now, we're seeing these two big projects, Summit and Navigator, where they're crisscrossing each other's lines all over the place. That creates different kinds of risks. It also creates a lot of inefficiencies. And it just simply spreads the risk of these pipelines over more and more, areas of population. And again, the CO2 carbon sequestration schemes are not just for the Midwest. They're talking about doing them for the entire country for CO2 sources, including power plants all over the country. So I'm sorry to say it, but folks who have been fighting, natural gas pipelines may end up in the future trying to fight carbon dioxide, carbon pipelines as well. But by simply pushing back now, we may be able to do a stitch in time and prevent the just irrational expansion of a lot of these projects. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Bill. If anybody has specific questions for Paul and Bill, you can put it in the chat. I was just going to say, if you're wondering who Paul was like trying to keep off screen, it was his adorable cat. He has a couple. I love them, Paul. So I'm sure you don't love them jumping on you in the middle of the presentation. Cats, kids, they're all the same. If you have questions for Paul and Bill, you can put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. As folks are typing in their questions, one question which may not be directly related to the report, but I'm sure either Bill or Paul can answer this. Cynthia asked that Summit guaranteed us at a meeting in Harlan on Friday that there'd be no water moisture in the CO2 pipeline. And she doesn't understand how they can promise that knowing how much moisture amount is in ethanol.
Yeah, my understanding is that, again, it is notoriously difficult to remove from CO2, and it can be minimized, but that seems like I'll say an aggressive promise.
Yeah, I would just add that, sure, the technology in theory will work. Technology in theory always works, but there's a huge difference between theory and practice. And, in theory, everything works, but here it doesn't necessarily. So if we have multiple ethanol or multiple CO2 sources hooked up to a single pipeline, will all the equipment and all the locations work properly all the time? And if it does get into these pipelines, then how are they going to remove the water? Because once it gets in, as Bill says, it can be difficult to get it out. So, it's just, we need, and there are no, one of the main most important of the study is that there are no federal standards that say, here's how much water can go in. And, and here's how you have to operate and maintain your equipment to make sure that the water doesn't get in. Another element that the Europeans have found out is that when you mix water with other kinds of contaminants, there can be a synergistic effect. And so what they think as being safe levels of water may actually not be safe because it's combining with other contaminants in ways that are unexpected to create additional corrosion.
The next question is, who currently regulates CO2 pipelines? And I think it would be helpful also, Bill and Paul, if you could explain how oil and gas pipelines are regulated differently, and then what about CO2 pipelines?
Sure, I can start. So we have two different sides of regulation. You have siting, and then you have the safety regulations of operation and construction. And so with gas pipelines, the siting is regulated by FERC. And then once they're sited, the organization PHMSA, which is part of DOT, it's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, part of Department of Transportation, then they regulate the operation and safety regulations of that pipeline. On the hazardous liquids side, there is no federal authority like FERC on siting, and so it comes down to things like NEPA and whatever permits they need. And then again, once they're cited, PHMSA takes over on the regulation of the operations and safety. And so CO2 would be on the hazardous liquid side. There is no federal agency looking at the siting of these the way FERC would for a gas line.
Yeah, and I'll just add that in addition to the safety regulation, first off, people need to understand that safety doesn't include everything conceivably that could be conceivably called safety. For example, county or state emergency response plans could be called safety, but the federal government does not, in fact, federalize county or state emergency response actions to a pipeline. So it's important not to see that everything conceivably falling under the rubric of safety is regulated by the federal government, because that's simply just not true. Another element to be aware of is that oil and gas pipelines are regulated commercially by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which determines companies' fees that they charge, which determines their profits. So, the oil and gas pipelines do not operate in a free market system. They are rate regulated like utilities. But carbon dioxide pipelines are completely unregulated commercially. So that means that, there isn't any kind of assurance that economically they'll make sense, or economically they will keep operating for long periods of time. We saw just recently one of the first bankruptcies of a natural gas pipeline out west. And, that's very unusual for oil and gas pipelines, but for these carbon dioxide pipelines, what happens if the federal government tax credits dry up, after just 12 years? Do they all go out of business and we end up with all these pipelines? There's no long-term commercial structure for these pipelines, which is very different than it is for natural gas and oil pipelines, which have their own issues, but at least there's some kind of commercial regulation, but for CO2, there's none.
You have about 3 more questions before we turn it over to Brian Jorde, who will talk about some legal next steps that are happening, not only in the carbon pipeline states, but could be happening around the country. So the first one is, who approves CO2 pipelines?
What do you think, Bill?
I think that's
They
a,
answer that in a snarky way, but it does not deserve snark, obviously.
that sounds like a Paul question to me.
Yeah, the answer to that is it depends on the state. So there isn't any federal overall approval, for the construction siting of pipelines. Some states do have siting and routing rules where the state government provides permits or does the permits for that. Some states have nothing. In states that have nothing, some places counties can then create ordinances, and the counties can regulate these pipelines through their local zoning ordinances. In addition, there are other ancillary federal permits, such as the 404 and 401 permits. I mean, the 401 is a state level permit, but the 404 is a federal permit, but there is no overall federal siting permit. So, that's one of the things that is when the folks are saying you need to find an attorney. You do need to find an attorney to help you understand the Byzantine nature of the regulatory structures and the relationship between all these laws. Because if you think it's logical, if you think it's predictable, if you think it's understandable, it isn't. And, it is just very complex at all levels sometimes. And so, it's just really important with carbon dioxide pipelines for folks to get in early and start understanding legally how it works in their state and also in their county.
Thanks, Paul and Bill. A couple questions Mark and Rebecca have both answered in the Q&A. So those are answered in the Q&A, but one I just wanted to highlight, which is a quick answer, is, are some of the carbon or maybe even hydrogen pipelines going to happen with converted fracked gas pipelines? And the answer is yes, they want to. But the Pipeline Safety Trust and Paul Blackburn actually did a whole blog on this on the Pipeline Fighters Hub, and Mark linked to that. We can link to that in the chat as well. One of the other questions is, are there legal actions planned to update the regulations and standards, or is there an avenue to upgrade those regulations? And I think, Bill, you're perfect to start this out with trying to open up that dialogue with PHMSA.
Yeah, we've had a good productive conversation with PHMSA through this report. I think our next step is directly petitioning PHMSA to open up a rulemaking, which we plan on doing very quickly. And I hope they're receptive to it. And I would say we've been having very productive conversations. So I'm optimistic, but we all know how long rulemaking takes. So I'm not as optimistic about how quickly we can get it done, but we'll just do our best.
And I'll just say that I know a lot of the advocacy groups are also fighting for state-based regulations. I know advocates in Virginia, West Virginia, Oregon, Minnesota, Illinois, Memphis, Tennessee. Whenever you face a pipeline, you then realize the gaps in where the protections are not happening, and then you try to push at the county and state level. And of course, the pipeline companies come in as well. So the organization that Rebecca's leading, the Pipeline Resource Center, they have some good information on this. The Pipeline Fighter Hub does as well. Mark answered this on internal pressures, but I also just want to get it into the webinar, what are the typical CO2 pipeline internal pressures and temperatures? And could you talk about the PSI of what they're expecting these carbon pipelines to be versus what maybe oil and gas are?
Paul, do you want to take that one to start?
Sure. Well, one of the things we talked about was that supercritical CO2 is its own material. One of the things Bill said, and that's really important to understand. It only exists above a minimum pressure of 1070 psi, 1070 psi. Now, a car tire is like 30 psi, right? So this is very high pressure as a minimum. And then very often these CO2 pipelines go up to just about 2200 psi, which is significantly higher than most oil and natural gas pipelines. So that's one of the reasons when these running ductile fractures happen, when all that pressure is suddenly released and the CO2 converts from a semi-fluid liquid form to a gas, it wants to take up a lot larger area. And the force of that conversion just blows the pipeline to pieces, essentially. So, this is a very dangerous situation if they do rupture. The temperatures are a little bit harder to say. The temperature is going to vary over the course of the pipeline route. But typically, I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but I think it was up to 120 degrees, but not super high pressure. And one of the things that's a bit spooky about them is if they drop below a minimum temperature, then they become technically a liquid pipeline and not a supercritical pipeline. And don't ask me to explain that, but but it is, the temperatures are of concern because another aspect of these pipelines is very different from other products, is that if they go outside of a very narrow range of pressure and temperature, there's a much greater likelihood of phase conversion to a gas or a liquid, and then the operational conditions, the operational characteristics of the pipeline can change radically. And so can the explosive forces. So, we can talk more about the pressure and temperature at some point, but it's a complex issue. It's one of the things that PHMSA really needs to look at because it isn't like oil and natural gas pipelines at all.
I think the last question, and then we're going to have Brian come on, who actually there's a couple questions in here that are more in Brian's lane. So I'll leave those in there for Brian to answer. But one of the things that advocates and landowners never thought they would have to learn about on pipelines is pump stations and shutoff valves. You learn a lot of industry language when you start to try to protect your land and water. So one of the questions is on that. To maintain that high of pressure in carbon pipelines, how many pumps are needed and what kind of physical size and environmental impacts such as noise, what kind of power would be required for these pump operations? And what if power goes out? What alternative power do they have to keep that constant pressure happening?
Do you want me to try and take that, Bill?
Sure, yeah.
Well, supercritical CO2 is roughly the same density as water. It's a little bit lighter, a little bit like heavy crude oil. And that means that now we don't have a lot of data available about the power demands, the pump station designs or anything else. This is all that new. But I'm going to assume, I think it's worthwhile, it can be assumed that because the weight of this supercritical CO2 is sort of like heavy crude oil or water, that the amount of pumping force required to move it would be similar to moving heavy crude oil. So that means that the pump stations would likely be similar in size, similar in noise, similar in power demand. And that power demand for a crude oil pipeline, heavy crude oil pipeline, like for line 3 or Keystone XL was going to be roughly 15 megawatts per pump station, typically 3 to 5 pumps in the station of multiple horsepower each. So that's all something of speculation on my part because we simply don't have any detailed information from the companies yet, but they will probably be similar to crude oil pump stations.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Bill, for not only all those answers, but making sure that we had that amazing report and blogs and all the things that Pipeline Safety Trust and Paul that you're doing with Bold Alliance continue to do to help folks understand this, because it's complicated and you guys make it easier. So thank you. Last but certainly not least is Brian Jorde with the Domino Law Group. He is the lead attorney that the group, the Easement Action Teams, LLC, have hired to help protect their property rights in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. Brian's going to talk a little bit about those operations, but also answer any questions that folks may have on the legal side of things. So Brian, I will throw it to you.
Excellent, thank you. I'll just run through a few slides, folks. I know you're going to probably have quite a few questions. So let me just do a overview with you of the easement team concept. Likely many of you are familiar with this, but it doesn't hurt to revisit it. So, you know, we back in 2010 got involved with landowners, and hearing some of the stories you heard tonight and on that short video at the beginning, it brings it all back. And I'm having all those same discussions right now in 2022, 12 years later, on different pipelines in different states. And the questions, the concerns, the where do we turn, what do we do, why is no one looking out for us, why are the laws so bad, all of those questions need to be answered. And not only do they need to be answered, a strategy needs to form around those questions and the unfortunate bad answers, which usually is because the pipeline companies are so powerful and their lobbyists have so much money to throw around. That's why you're in the situation where you are, because we are dealing with very bad laws, or lack thereof, by the pipeline companies greasing the wheels years before, and now you're just learning about this. So all of this, it's the same thing every time, right? Again, the stories are the same. It's just like insert new pipeline company, new state, new project, but their playbook is the same. And so the easement team is something that we created back in 2012 after being 2 years into the KXL fight in Nebraska, which had the only group of holdout landowners in the Midwest that was affected, in the states affected by that project, because the early states had just resigned themselves to the fact pipeline companies too big, too powerful, has the laws, has the political connections, we can't do anything. We might as well just sign these easements, even though I don't understand them, have no idea what the ramifications are going to be, but I feel hopeless. And what the easement teams help do is create a vehicle, because there are concerned people, not only across the state, but across the country on these intrastate projects, such as the CO2 Navigator and Summit pipelines right now. And so how do we turn those people that are in opposite corners of a given state or even a region into believing there is hope, there is a path, there is a way forward? Well, you've got to have a vehicle or the glue to hold together the disparate landowners that otherwise would never know each other, never cross paths, and hold them together not only for a few months, but a decade or more in many cases. And so the easement teams were born out of that, to hold together, to give hope to the group. And that allowed landowners and families that just were helpless and hopeless to band together, to become greater than themselves, and become a family photo montage here, a mosaic in an exhibit that was used at our Public Service Commission when the rubber hit the road and the fight to talk about the siting and the routing and the safety and the terms and the poor treatment, et cetera, and all the concerns of farmers and ranchers are heard when you get to your state agency proceeding. And so the easement team not only is providing the legal framework, strategy, direction, planning, and a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes, but also is part and parcel of the bigger network, like you've heard about this evening, of the BOLD, of the Pipeline Safety Trust, of the other organizations and groups, not only in your region or state, but around the country, that have been through what you're going through and then are sharing information, are again helping with best practices, helping with, well, what's going on, you know, in Virginia, or what's going on in Oregon, what's going on in South Dakota. And so it's this entire connected network that then is connected through the various organizations, which is why it's important to have the separate pieces. And the easement team represents, in the model, the landowner group. And it's not just, we're going to stop this pipeline or fight this pipeline over my dead body. It's even the people who say, you know, I don't know about all that. I just want better easement terms. Can you help me with that? Right? And then the pitch is, the best easement for you, Mr. Farmer, Ms. Rancher, is no easement, meaning no pipeline. That's going to be the safest and give you the most protection and make sure that your legacy, your land, what you want to pass down to generations, what you've worked so hard for, will likely continue. And so it's a big tent approach where along the way, most landowners do tend to become anti-pipeline when they have to deal with the pipeline company and their agents, employees, and contractors. They come over, but it's important that we have a big tent approach because you never have enough, right? You know, all the landowners aren't enough, but you want to get as many as you can to band together because these are long and painful journeys. And you want to be able to turn to someone in your community, in your state, not just the legal counsel or not just the on-the-ground organizers, and talk about it and work through it and have that support system. So it's really a kind of a holistic approach to getting landowners, frankly, through the process and then educating and empowering them. So just a few slides. You know, right now we've got formally set up across the Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, and the North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, all working together through unified legal representation, sharing best practices. You already know these companies aren't your neighbor. They can send out as many glossy ads, give the fire departments new pickup trucks, put on pancake feeds, give the high school kids scholarships. They can do all that, frankly, nonsense. But at the end of the day, they want something that is yours. They want to take it for next to nothing, and they want to leave you with the liability, the taxes, questions about if you can even insure yourself in case of a catastrophic event. And the only way you can compete is if you're one strong voice, a coalition, a co-op, an organized group working together. And what we always say is you don't build the army after the invasion. We have to be being organized well in advance. And then we take the legal action through the state system, whether it be your Iowa Utility Board, a public service or public utility commission on a state level for the entities that are in charge of siting or routing, which is in CO2 pipelines and major oil pipelines, all at the state level and not at the national level like the natural gas pipelines are. And if all of that fails, it doesn't work, this is going through, it was a rubber stamp, we fight collectively to get better easement terms so you're protected. Now, a lot of people, when I talk about, you know, the better easement terms early on, we don't even want to talk about that. Why are we talking about negotiating? We want to stop this, we want to fight. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. Because if we are demanding better easement terms on the front end, that's doing what? That's raising the cost. That's increasing what it costs for the pipeline companies to be a part of this. That is making them answer questions in the media. That's raising questions. That's getting the coffee shop talk of, hey, wait, maybe these aren't so good. Did you hear about this or read about this? So all of these things, when we're talking about the terms and how bad the contract is, it's not because I want to jump to negotiations or whoever you're working with. It's because we start at the end and then work backwards and educate everyone on how bad this is, not just necessarily focused on an explosion or hopefully an isolated event. Let's talk about all the other problems in these agreements. The easement teams help you understand what an easement even is, what it means, you know, what are the risks that you still have. We go through the easement agreement, and briefly on this, what do we do when we get an easement agreement? Our eyes search for the dollar sign. Like, what am I getting paid? What do you propose to pay me for this? don't do that. You know, you need to start at the line, the first sentence of who are you dealing with? Case in point, Summit Carbon Solutions. Who is it? What are their assets? Who owns them? Who has the say-so? Is this a shell company that's going to just declare bankruptcy at the first sight of a problem, right? It's educating through all of these steps and then educating the public, elected officials, et cetera, on all of the problems. So, you know, you've all heard, don't worry, the pipeline company will pay for damages. It's also helping people understand what you probably realize, but might take for granted when you are initially trusting, especially I like to say in the Midwest, you know, it's like we give everyone the benefit of the doubt and they kind of have to beat us down a few times typically before we realize, hey, maybe this person can't be trusted, right? But it's all about forcing the happy talk from the land agents, et cetera, that are the professional salespeople and forcing it in writing, forcing them to put things in writing and not just have oral promises that can go unenforced. It's giving people the confidence to not sign an easement. You've got people on either side of you, neighbors, who are signing easements. And once you've taken action, you don't want to feel like you've done something wrong or have been had or taken. So what happens? You kind of get entrenched. And now you almost become a defender of the pipeline company because it's like, well, I've already signed off. And you start to realize maybe this was the problem. So it's even harder to convince then the landowner that's on either side of people that have already signed up to hold strong. And part of it is simply sit on your hands. Do not sign anything because there's no rush. They don't have their approvals in almost all cases. And if you're going to do anything, do nothing in terms of not signing. Working through the state agency, example, South Dakota, what is party status? What is intervention? How do I get in and make my voice heard? How do I develop testimony? What does that look like? What are the rules of the road? What type of evidence is important? What questions should we be asking the pipeline company to set them up for failure in the agency process? Are there expert witnesses? Who are they? Where are they? What should they say? What can they say? What are the legal arguments, right? How do we put on and orchestrate the trial or the hearing? Who's handling the appeal? All of this is flowing through the model, our model of the easement teams. These are things you don't want to have to think about. You frankly can't do them on your own. More benefits. I can't underestimate, or I guess not emphasize this enough. News, earned media. It's one thing to have a collection of landowners out there banding together. That's great. But we found when you have an entity, an organization that the press can point to, can mention, can say, go to the website, you can refer it out to other people. It shows that this is an organized effort. This is something that is worthy of respect and worry from the industry. It makes them sometimes change terms midstream, even before you hold their feet to the fire at the ultimate agency hearing or trial. Case in point, in KXL, they initially in Nebraska, the easement said that they could have more than one pipeline. Well, through shaming them through the easement teams and the work of Bold and others, and being consistent with our talking points and our messaging and our narrative, they took that out along the way. I mean, that's a victory right there before we even got to the nitty gritty, limiting it to one pipeline at least. And you can get to better terms and concessions because you're part of a group that has to be taken seriously, which again funnels down from the media spreading out their respect. And now, rather than picking you off one by one, they realize, hey, let's at least deal with this group and negotiate, give up some things that maybe wouldn't have anyway. And all of this, all of the talking about the easement terms, concessions, the earned media, all of that makes it more likely that you have a chance to stop the pipelines completely cold, as we've learned over a lot of successful battles over the last few years especially. So we're not just talking about the terms because we're trying to jump forward. It's kind of like the Karate Kid when he's washing the cars and painting the fence and he's like, I want to learn karate. All of these little things are working towards and are assisting the ultimate big goal, which would be the safest pipeline, no eminent domain abuse. So that's, in a rapid fire nutshell of, the high level, what it is, but all of the benefits and the holistic approach of helping the landowners all the way through, but also building the resistance, building the knowledge and education throughout your entire community, your entire state, even getting to the elected officials, working with the counties on ordinances to protect you in the future. And the death by 1,000 cuts is exactly what we were saying in 2010, and what I say and echo with that Jill said all around the country, right? Anyone that'll listen, that's the only way. You have to score little victories, right? We are that gnat that's flying around that's just annoying, but it won't go away. It's there, and they can't quite swat us. They're trying, but we keep coming. And the way you hold that together is by having a network and a system, and then a landowner piece, a landowner organization within that bigger network. So I'm sure I'm talking to a lot of my clients and people on easement teams tonight, but if you're learning about this, potentially gearing up for a battle, highly urge you to bring some formality and structure to the good and hardworking landowners and neighbors in your state, so you can work together, band together. So with that, I will stop my sharing and open it up for any questions.
Thanks, Brian. There's a couple questions already, but just a reminder, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can put it in the Q&A section, and I'll pull up that question for Brian. One of the questions is, are pipeline companies insuring for individual losses of life and property along the line in the event that a pipeline breaches, or do individuals have to buy their own insurance? And I know you love this type of question.
Yeah, no, I love this type of question because it shows, frankly, how preposterous what they are suggesting is, because there is no insurance you can buy. And if it was offered, you couldn't afford the premiums. So you can't even protect yourself against a catastrophic event other than selling your land, moving away, and just giving up on everything you've worked for. That's the only way you can absolutely protect yourself. If the pipeline is coming, someone in someone's family at a minimum will be a statistic sometime throughout the life of that pipeline. And do they insure? Okay, so let's say they have a gob of money and you die. Well, is that very good that they have money to pay your widow or widower in your family? I mean, in talking in the catastrophic terms, that doesn't matter. And no, they don't insure against that. Now, they have insurance, but we're not privy to those policies. We don't know what the exclusions are. Your general liability and property insurance policies have pollution exclusions. And I guarantee you liquefied CO2 will be defined as a pollutant. And if any damage or risk to property or life is deemed to be caused by the insurance people in the cubicles in the tall buildings on either coast to be emanating from or caused by CO2, a pollutant, you will not have coverage. And then you can be brought in to the fight because maybe you drove a combine across the easement. Maybe you drove a grain truck, and aren't those pretty heavy? And there was a rupture, there was a break in the sleeve right there. Maybe you should also be sued so your pot of money can come into it and help spread out the pipeline company's risk. That's what happens.
Brian, in a lot of the meetings in the different states, except Nebraska, because we don't have a government process in Nebraska, but Iowa, South Dakota, and North Dakota too, for these particular carbon pipelines, the companies have been talking about how this could potentially be a 25-year pipeline. That's how long essentially that pipeline would last, but they're asking for permanent easements. So what happens after those 25 years, and what exactly does a permanent easement mean for a landowner?
So permanent or perpetual means just that, to the end of time, until Earth no longer exists. And it makes no sense that when we know the project has a finite life, in terms of the infrastructure itself, man-made always has a finite life. We know from what Paul touched upon, there's right now 12-year tax credits. So really the financial ability to survive and to make this viability financially is only 12 years. And guess what? Next presidential election, how do we know that doesn't go to zero? and they're withdrawn or they're eliminated or they're not extended, et cetera. So there could be a bunch of stranded infrastructure, but the perpetual easement means the pipeline company can sell, transfer, or assign the easement even before there's a pipeline or after there's a pipeline to anyone on earth, to China, PetroChina, United Arab Emirates, any country on earth they could transfer the rights to. You have no veto power. You don't get paid again. You don't get to renegotiate. You have no say so. So even if you got to know and like pipeline company XYZ, these are incredibly valuable assets to these companies, and these companies can get sold, merged, and transfer these easements, and you have no say so.
One question in the chat is one that we get often is how are we funding the easement team model? I'll talk on one side and then you can talk about how the landowners, how it's a cooperative model. The easement team is a nonprofit, and so there are grants that those of us who are on the organizing side of things write to groups like the Cloud Mountain Foundation and the Equation Campaign are two of the foundations that are helping support this. Those are foundations that really care about making sure that farmers and ranchers, landowners, tribal communities are protected against big corporations. And so they view these pipeline fights as making sure land and water is protected. So that's how some organizing money comes in. And then Brian can talk about the co-op model. So landowners are part of this process.
Yep, so definitely. So, you know, from a portion of what the easement team is, that is funded by generous donations and support, again, from a lot of the behind the scenes people and the hard work that Jane and others do to bring money and resources, because none of this can be done. It's not like an easement team creates itself and is just sitting there waiting to help out, right? Money and time and legal efforts has to go in just to even get these things set up, right? And then once the landowner group starts to become more organized, then they also formally hire, under our model, a legal team, myself, our office, other counsel that we work with, and I coordinate their efforts and work product. And then the landowners have skin in the game for that piece. And the only way that works is if you get a large enough group and then are spreading out that cost, right, over a large number of people, because otherwise none of you on your own can possibly fight these companies, even if you were a billionaire, frankly. And so that's the way the model works. We've got, for the organizing piece and the outreach and the kind of the keeping people connected year after year and doing different events, a lot outside funding really drives that. And then from the landowner nitty gritty, protecting your property rights, fighting eminent domain, that's landowner funded with some grants also along the way as they can be brought in.
And Brian, if a landowner wants to be part of one of the easement action teams in their state, or if they're not directly impacted, but still want to sign up in case the route changes, which everybody on this call knows if you faced a pipeline, the route could change a little bit or a lot. So it could then go on your neighbor's land, et cetera. How did they sign up with one of the easement action teams?
Yeah, I mean, and that's another pipeline game, is that they never give the full maps or the full names when they're filing their application on a state basis, right? And then there's a deadline for you landowners to join in, and you get all fired up and you join in. And like just happened in South Dakota, 1 hour before the deadline of April 8th, 5 p.m., Summit Carbon Solutions sends out new maps of reroutes that they're rerouting around. And I had just filed party status for 209 landowners, and now they're rerouting around a portion of them, which, hey, is great for those of you that joined up, another power of the easement team model, because they're like, we don't want to deal with these guys. Let's at least route around some of them. But then completely unfair because the deadline for party intervention is gone. And now you've got hundreds of new people that, tough luck, now they're on the new route. So I just had to throw that in there because I'm battling it right now this week, this kind of more games that they're playing. But in order to get involved, it's pretty simple. Whatever the state is, just that state name, then the word easement.org. So North Dakota easement.org, Iowa easement.org. You can go there. You can email to get directly in contact with us and the organizers. There's a form, one-page form commitment that you're going to stand together with your neighbors and friends and not, give our information to Summit or whoever else the pipeline company is. And it's a very simple step to get involved. Just go to the website.
Thanks, Brian. I think we answered all the, oh, sorry. Is there a legal block to exporting gas from a pipeline that used eminent domain? I've never heard that question before, but it's actually interesting.
Legal block, I'm not sure I'm following that. Is the question, is there a way to stop it?
Meaning if a pipeline company used eminent domain, is there any limits on them then exporting that gas, right? So they used eminent domain because it was for, public purpose, for American energy uses, but now they're exporting the product that they used eminent domain for.
Yeah, no, and that's a trick. It's, like right now it's in CO2. We've got to save the ethanol industry because I guess all of a sudden all the ethanol plants were going bankrupt and we didn't know it. And so we're going to save the ethanol industry. But those pipelines could be converted, or in the case of a major oil pipeline, they can say one thing, but they say, well, the economics has changed and gosh darn it, now we're going to do this and it's our pipeline anyway. And we already have eminent domain, so forget about what we said, 2 years ago. It's once they have their foot in the door, they are in control, which is why it's so important on the front end to either stop it or get as many protections and as many state agency or federal agency safeguards in writing that they have to abide by.
Exactly. And one of the reminders is even if they took your land by eminent domain or landowners willingly sold, and they have that easement, a perpetual easement, even if they don't build that project, that easement doesn't go back to the landowner.
No, there is no internal reversion right where just by fact of abandonment, it goes back. So they can sell that to next company that has a great idea for a new pipeline. And so there's landowners out there that frankly think they're kind of slick, and they sign up, they get the money, and then they hope everyone else fights for them while they are sitting on the money. But they have given away legal rights and interests to their land that they can never get back. So you better be sure that's enough money for the end of time and for any possible project for you to sleep well at night. So I always say there's not enough money for you to have peace of mind that you're going to be protected. So just do nothing, don't sign an easement, and join an easement team.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We've hit our hour and a half, so we're going to end the seminar. Just a few reminders. Mark with the Bold team, if you joined the seminar, he will be sending out a summary email with all the links to the groups that were talked about today and all the resources that are helping out with landowners and communities fighting these pipelines. You can always go on Bold site or the Pipeline Fighters Hub site as well. One thing to remember is the question asked, is there an easement team in Illinois or Minnesota, the other two states, fighting these carbon pipelines? Not yet, but groups on the ground and landowners are talking about that. So hopefully soon there will be as well. The most important thing that I know all of us agree is that in America, somebody's property rights shouldn't be taken away for private gain. Eminent domain was never meant for private gain, and that's exactly what oil, gas, and now carbon pipelines have eroded property rights over the years. All of our groups are committed to making sure that people's property rights are protected, that water's protected, that the land that you saw in many of the landowners presentations are protected. And we didn't talk about it tonight, but we stand firmly with tribal nations' sovereign rights to protect their land and their water. So together we can do this. It's proven that when landowners and tribes and environmental activists and legal teams all stick together, you can stop the big Goliath from coming in. So thank you to all the Davids out there that have fought and won these pipeline battles, and to everybody who's currently trying to protect their land and water. We all are here for you, and we're going to do it by sticking together. Thanks, everybody.